The Secret of the Old Mill, Chapter 9. The Rescue. Frank Hardy had seen that the rope was insecure. He had already laid a plan of action in case the rope broke. The rapids were just around the bend in the river. The stream was narrow at that point, and the willow trees overhung the bank. The moment the rope broke, Frank leapt out into action. He stumbled free of the group and raced along the river bank towards the willows. He could see Joe struggling helplessly in the swiftly flowing stream, and he knew that if the current once carried him beyond the willows, his brother would be doomed. No human being could live in those tossing rapids. Could he reach the trees in time? Would the current carry Joe and Lester close enough to the bank to enable him to rescue them? Would he be able to hold them until help arrived? The bank suddenly dipped, and he hurried down the grassy slope towards the willows. He was still in advance of the struggling figures in the stream, and he knew that he had a chance, although it was but a slim chance at best, of rescuing his brother and the strange boy. He reached the willows at last. They grew out over the smooth and rushing water. Frank ran to the edge of the soggy bank, grasped one of the trees, and leaned out over the stream. So far, luck was with him, for Joe was still a few yards away. But he was still too far out in the water to enable Frank to grasp him as he passed. But Joe had guessed Frank's intentions as well as he could, in spite of the fact that he was handicapped by the weight of the unconscious Lester. He tried to struggle closer towards the shore. The current was with him, for it swung close to the bend at this point, and it swept Joe directly beneath the overhanging willow to which Frank was clinging, steadying himself with his feet on the bank. As Joe was swept beneath him, Frank reached far down. For one breathless second, he thought he had missed his brother's outreached hand. Then their fingers met, and he gripped Joe's tightly, hanging on to him with all his strength. The willow bent and swayed beneath the added weight, but Frank held firm. The muscles of his arm ached with the strain, and he knew that he could not hold out long. But already he could hear shouts and the sounds of running feet that told him the others were coming to the rescue. "Hang on, we're coming!" Chet was shouting, and a moment later Frank heard his chum thrashing through the bushes. Phil and the others were close behind. With his companions clinging to him, Frank managed to drag Joe ashore, still grasping the clothes of the unconscious boy. Dripping wet, Joe scrambled up on the bank, and together they carried Lester out of the willows on the grass. First aid was immediately rendered, and Lester was not seriously hurt. He had swallowed a great quantity of water, and the blow on the head had stunned him. But after a while he stirred and opened his eyes. The old man looked relieved, although the other two men watched the scene with indifference. When Lester was finally able to sit up, his first question was, "Who saved me?" Frank indicated his brother. "Joe did." Lester struggled to his feet and gratefully shook Joe's hand. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, simply. "But you know I'm grateful. I would have been drowned if it hadn't been for you." Joe was embarrassed. "It was him, really," he said, indicating Frank. "If it hadn't been for him, we'd have both been in the rapids by now." Lester grasped Frank by the hand. "I have both of you to thank. You risked your lives to help me." The old man nodded. "It was brave work," he said reluctantly. "I'm mighty thankful to you boys for saving the lad. And after this," he said harshly to Lester, "stay away from that mill race. I've told you 50 times that you're liable to get drowned fooling around there. Next time you mightn't be so lucky." "I'm sorry, Uncle Doc," answered the boy. The party made their way back towards the mill, and the boys were conscious of the sullen glances of the two men who were with Uncle Doc. It was clear that the pair wished the lads would go away. Better take the kid inside and let him dry his clothes, advised Markle roughly, gesturing to Lester. We'd better get back to work. Joe's clothes were soaked, but the offer evidently did not include him. Have you got a fire in the mill? He hinted hopefully. Uncle Doc glanced at Markle, who shook his head in a surly manner. No, he answered. Lester can go to bed until his clothes dry. My own clothes are pretty wet. Markle affected not to hear this remark, but hastened on towards the mill. When did you take over the mill? Asked Frank of the old man. A few weeks ago. What are your prices for milling? Asked Chet. My father was saying the other day that he wished the old Turner mill would be open again. If he had known you were running the place, he would have been over here now. He can put a lot of trade your way. Uncle Doc hesitated and glanced at the other man. You'd better talk to him, Kurt. Our prices are pretty high, said Kurt shortly. We're making breakfast foods chiefly. But don't you need grain? We're pretty well stocked up. What are your milling prices anyway? Persisted Chet. Kurt thought for a moment, then gave Chet a list of prices which were so greatly in excess of those charged by the Bayport mills that they were prohibitive. Why, that's higher than what Dad would want to pay, Chet said. Uncle Doc shrugged his shoulders. Take it or leave it. We ain't asking for his trade. You won't get it. Not at those prices. It was quite evident that Uncle Doc and his strange associates were not desirous of encouraging any outside trade for the old mill. However, Frank realized that the men had a right to manufacture patent food in secret if they wished, so he nudged Chet as a signal against any further questions. They had reached the door of the mill by now, and the Markle hustled Lester inside before he had a chance to say anything further to the boys, although the lad cast an appealing glance behind, as though he would have liked again to express his thanks to his rescuers. Where do you fellows live? Asked Kurt, peering in from under his shaggy eyebrows. Bayport. You're a long way from home. We're just on a hike, explained Frank. We just thought we'd come around this way. You'll be late for supper if you don't hurry back. This broad hint was not lost on the boys. It was clear that the men wanted to get rid of them. I guess we'll be on our way. We'll go in for a swim farther up the river so Joe can have a chance to dry his clothes. This seemed to rid Uncle Doc of the fact that Joe had, after all, saved Lester's life. He reached for his pocket. I'd like to reward you for saving the lad, he said, becoming suddenly affable. Joe shook his head, and when Uncle Doc took 2 $5 bills from his pocket and offered them to the boys, one to Frank and the other to Joe, they disclaimed any intention of accepting money for what they plainly had been their duty. But no sooner had Uncle Doc extended the bills than the other man, Kurt, gave a muffled exclamation and stepped forward. He snatched the money from Uncle Doc's hands and quickly turned round, with his back to the boys. The interruption was only of about a second's duration, for Kurt at once wheeled about and again extended the money. He gave a short, nervous laugh. My mistake, he said. I thought he was only offering you $1 each. You deserve 5. It's all right. Here, take it. He thrust the money upon them, but they refused. Kurt did not press the point. He put the bill back in his own pocket. All right. If you won't, I suppose there's no use arguing, he said with evident relief. But we're very grateful to you just the same. Well, Doc, what say we get back to work? He continued, turning to his companion. Uncle Doc turned away and went back into the mill with Kurt. It's plain they don't want us hanging around, said Joe, with a rueful glance at the clothes. Let's go on up to the river so I can throw these clothes over a hickory limb and get 'em dried out before we start back home. Chapter 10. The New Boat. A week went by, a week in which the Hardy boys and their chums again wrestled with the refectory Latin phrases as the examinations drew near. There was little time for fun, even outside school hours. The boys were all overcome by that helpless feeling that comes with the approach of an examination. The feeling that everything they had ever known had somehow escaped their memory, and that as fast as they learned one fact, they forgot another. But the week was over at last, and on Saturday morning, Fenton Hardy looked up from his newspaper with a quiet smile. "What's the problem for today?" he asked his sons. "Nothing in particular," said Frank. "I was thinking I'd dig into the Latin for an hour or so, although I'm so sick of the sight of that book that I'd like to throw it out the window." "I'm away behind in my algebra," spoke up Joe. "But it's too nice a day to study. Anyway, I've been working hard all week." "Perhaps if you went down to the boathouse, you might find something there," suggested their father casually. The boys stared incredulously. Then they gave a simultaneous whoop of delight. "You don't mean to say the motorboat is here!" exclaimed Frank. Their father had taken charge of buying of the motorboat for them. They had not expected that the craft would arrive until the start of the summer holidays. Fenton Hardy merely smiled and turned to the financial page. "It mightn't be a bad idea to go down to the boathouse anyway," he said. The boys needed no further urging. Within a few seconds they were scrambling to their feet, and within minutes they were racing down the front steps, and soon they were hastening towards Barrymont Bay. "The boat must have arrived here during the week, and he had it taken to the boathouse without telling us about it," said Frank. "I guess he was afraid we wouldn't do much studying for the rest of the week if we knew it was here. I guess we wouldn't have either." When they reached the boathouse, they could hardly contain themselves in their eagerness to see if the boat had indeed arrived. Frank inserted the key in the lock and opened the door. They stepped inside. There, rocking gently in the waves, was a long, graceful craft, white with gilt trimmings, a motorboat that gave an immediate impression of strength and power without the sacrifice of graceful lines. There was a flag at the bow and at the stern, and the fittings glistened. The seats were upholstered in leather, and across the bow was the name of the boat in raised letters, the Sleuth. The name had been chosen by the Hardy boys previous to the purchase of the craft, and after much argument. "She's a beauty," breathed Frank in deep admiration. "I'll say. The smoothest-looking boat on the bay, and I'll bet it's the fastest. Oh, boy, if we'd only known this was here all week." Without further ado, the boys descended from the landing stage and got into the boat to inspect the craft more closely. Everything they saw only served to confirm their first impression that the Sleuth was without doubt the neatest, most compact, and most beautiful motorboat ever launched. The fittings were bright and shining. The wheel responded to the slightest touch. "How's the gas and oil?" asked Frank, settling in the steersman's seat. "Full up. And look, Frank, even the license is here. All right, cast off." Joe opened the boathouse door, unhooked the chains that kept the craft secure, and they leapt into the Sleuth as the engine sputtered and roared. Frank threw in the clutch, and the roar died away to a purr, and the boat backed swiftly and smoothly out into the bay. "The engine runs like a watch," reported Frank in delight. Once outside the boathouse, he headed the craft out towards the open bay. It was soon apparent that the engine of the Sleuth was very powerful, for the boat leapt forward as Frank increased speed. And yet there was very little noise. The noise of the boat cut the water like a knife, and the craft skimmed out into the bay like a swallow. Both boys were almost inarticulate with delight. The sense of speed and freedom held them spellbound. Frank changed places with Joe and gave his brother a turn at the wheel. Joe was astonished at the immediate response that came to his lightest touch. In anticipation of getting the boat, both lads had taken lessons in running such a craft from Tony Prideaux and others who had motor boats, and, as a consequence, Joe and Frank felt thoroughly at home with both the engine and the steering wheel. They circled about and came down toward shore again. It was a sunny morning, and 2 or 3 motorboats were spluttering and backfiring in their shelters near the shore. Out of one boathouse came a rakish black craft that the boys recognized instantly as a motorboat belonging to Tony Prideaux's father. "There's Tony," exclaimed Frank. "He always goes boating on Saturday mornings. Let's give him a race. His boat's supposed to be the fastest on the bay. I don't care whether it is or not. He'll have to go some to beat the sleuth. We'll challenge him." Although Tony had seen their boat, he had not yet recognized the boys in it, and when they drew alongside, he gave a shout of surprise. "Well, gee whiz!" he exclaimed. "Look who's here! I was wondering who owned that swell new tub. Is this the new boat?" "This is she. And she's fast, boy. She's fast. Want a race?" Tony laughed. "I hate to show you up so soon. You won't like your new boat near as well if I beat you the first time you get into a race. You won't beat us. You've got a pretty speedy old boat there, all right. But you've met your match this time." "Do you really think so? Do you really think you can lick me?" asked Tony. "You know you haven't a chance. This is a real speedboat. This is a better one. Come on, we'll start from that buoy." Frank pointed to a buoy that was riding the waves about 100 yards away, and the 2 boats sped towards it. They kept on even terms until they came abreast of the buoy, and then Tony shouted, "Now!" At the same instant, the boats leapt forward. The engine of Tony's craft set up a deafening roar, but the sleuth merely changed from a purr to a growl and sprang swiftly through the water. Tony had the advantage in that he knew his boat well, and he knew just how much power it would stand. Within a half a minute, he had established a substantial lead, while the sleuth was surging along in its wake. But Frank knew that the boat was more powerful than it seemed. Gradually, he let her out, and the sleuth responded, until at last he could see that they were gaining on the craft ahead. By this time, Tony was tearing along at the highest speed of which his craft could go, and the boat was almost raising out of the water with the force of its momentum. Rapidly, the sleuth overhauled the flying craft. Swiftly, it drew abreast, and the boys had a glimpse of Tony's astonished face as he glanced over the side at them. The sleuth roared on, rocking and swaying, with spray dashing over the bows. There was no doubt as to which was the swifter craft. Tony was being left behind. When a gap of 300 or 400 yards separated the 2 boats, and when it was apparent that he had no hope of overhauling his rival, Tony lessened the speed of his craft as a signal that he had been beaten. Frank immediately throttled down the sleuth and swung her round in a wide circle. Then, at a more reasonable speed, they went back to meet Tony. Their chum was astonished beyond all measure. "I thought you were just kidding when you said you'd race with me," he shouted as they drew closer. "No kidding about the race, was there?" "I'll say there wasn't. I let my old boat go out as fast as she'd go. I thought the engine was going to jump out once or twice. I didn't think there was a motor boat in the bay that could beat me, but I guess that tub of yours has it beat. When'd you get it? This is the first time we've been out. Wish I could stick around and race. But," Tony said regretfully, "but I have to go back to the boathouse. I promised my father I'd help him at the warehouse this morning." "Tough luck," sympathized Frank. "We may see you this afternoon, but no more racing until the engine is worked in a bit better. It was foolish to let her out while she's so stiff." "Where are you going now?" "Oh, we'll just cruise around," said Frank. "I was thinking we might go up to Barmont Village and back." "That's a nice run." "It'll take you about half an hour if you go easy. About 5 minutes if you let that speed demon out for all she's worth." "We'll go easy," laughed Joe. "We don't want to ruin the engine on the first trip out." "Runs pretty smooth," approved Tony. "It'll stand quite a lot. Well, I must be going. Goodbye." He turned the nose of his craft towards the boathouse and drew swiftly away. The Hardy boys set out in the opposite direction, surging through the water towards Barmont Village. Chapter 11. A Man in a Hurry. Barmont Village lay several miles from Bayport on the shore of Barmont Bay, from which it got its name. It was a small place inhabited by fishermen chiefly, and it was a distributing center for the farmers who lived in the surrounding areas. The Hardy boys had no particular object in going to Barmont, beyond the fact that the village served as a destination that gave their boating trip more of a purpose than there would have been had they merely cruised aimlessly around. Although the sky had been clear and the sun had been shining when they set out, Frank noticed that already clouds were coming in from the sea and the wind was shifting. Storms sprang up suddenly along the coast, but he was not alarmed, for he knew that they would have the wind with them on the return trip. The sloop sped smoothly along, the engine purring without a miss. The craft neither rocked nor rolled, but cut the waves cleanly. Both Frank and Joe were delighted beyond measure with their boat, and at that moment would not have traded places with a king. By the time they reached Barmont, the sky was cloudier than ever, and there was a hint of rain, so the boys determined that they would not stay long in the village. They made a landing at the wharf and got out to stretch their legs, being greatly pleased in the meantime by the complimentary remarks passed by such villagers as were about at the time on the appearance of their boat. These were not empty compliments, for the Barmont people prided themselves on knowing a good boat when they saw one, and there was nothing grudging in their approval of the sleuth. Two old fishermen sat out on the wharf, with their feet dangling over the water, and discussed the motorboat in every detail from bow to stern, agreeing that she combined strength and appearance in a remarkable degree. When they had finally affixed their seal of approval to the sleuth, they refilled their pipes and settled down to an endless series of reminiscences concerning boats that they had once sailed. "The sky's beginning to look black," pointed out Frank to his brother after they had listened to a number of these tales. "I guess we'd better be starting." Joe moved away reluctantly, for he was fascinated by the highly colorful yarns of the two old salts. But when he glanced at the lowering horizon, he realized that Frank's apprehensions were justified, and that it would be better for them to start back to Barmont without delay. They got into the boat and were just about to cast off when there came a sudden interruption. A man came running down the road leading to the dock. He was waving his arms and shouting, "Hi! Hey there! Wait for me!" Somewhat puzzled, the Hardy boys waited. They did not recognize the man. He was a complete stranger to them. He was stout and thick-set, florid of face, and had red hair. And he ran out on the wharf, and he panted from his exertions. "Whew!" he exclaimed, mopping his brow with a bright silk handkerchief. "I nearly missed you." "What do you want?" Frank asked. "I want to go to Bayport right away. I want to catch that train. And if you can get me there in 20 minutes, I'll give you $10. Will you take me?" The Hardy boys looked at one another doubtfully. Both were conversant with the Bayport train schedules, and neither was aware of any train that left Bayport at that hour in the morning. Still, the stranger seemed very much in earnest, and he drew a $10 bill from his pocket as proof of his good faith. "Come," he said impatiently. "How about it? Will you take me or will you not? I want to be there in 20 minutes. There's $10 in it for you." $10, as Frank said later, is not to be sneezed at. When they bought the motorboat, their father made the stipulation that they should not draw on their bank accounts to pay for the gasoline, and every cent was precious for that reason. "Jump in," Frank said. "I guess we can get you there in 20 minutes all right." "Thanks," said the florid-faced man, getting into the boat. "Take it as quick as you can." Frank slipped into his seat, and in a few moments the engine was roaring as the sleuth glided away from the shadow of the wharf and headed out into the bay. She rapidly picked up speed, and soon the salt spray was flying as the motorboat tore through the waves, her nose pointing towards Bayport. The stranger settled back with a sigh of relief. "Mighty good thing I met you," he said. "I was beginning to think I wouldn't be able to get out at all. There was only a rickety-looking old car in the village, and I was afraid to take a chance on it, for I don't think it would have lasted a mile without falling to pieces. It was lucky I saw this boat when I did." The sleuth sped along under a darkening sky. They were running close to the shore in order to cut off as much distance as possible and keep a beeline for Bayport. It was possible to have a clear view of the road that ran just above the beach. Joe noticed that the stranger cast frequent anxious glances towards the shore. Suddenly an expression of alarm crossed the man's face, and Joe saw that he was watching two figures who had appeared on the road and who were running along, waving their arms, evidently trying to attract attention. "Somebody's signaling to us?" he said to Frank. Frank looked up. The two men on the road were making frantic efforts to draw attention as they waved their arms and leapt about like lunatics. "Friends of yours?" asked Frank of their passenger. The florid-faced man laughed. The laugh was meant to be carefree and hearty, but there was no disguising the note of uneasiness beneath it. Yes, they're friends of mine," he admitted. "I put one over on them that time," he chuckled nervously. "They're just beginning to realize that I've given them the slip." "What's the big idea?" "That's the time I fooled them." The stranger laughed loudly, too loudly, in fact. "You see, I was going to be married. That's why I have to catch that train. I kept it a secret until this morning, but my friends got wind of it and thought they'd play a practical joke on me. I started out in plenty of time for the train, but they had fixed the engine of my car so it broke down, and I had to come back to Beaumont. They were trying to hold me back for a while, and I was beginning to think that they had gotten away with it, but I bested 'em. I fooled them that time." He laughed again, but still there was that note of insincerity in his mirth that had aroused the suspicions of the Hardy boys at first. They said nothing, and the stranger evidently thought his story had been believed, for he sat back in the boat with a complacent air. But Frank glanced again at the two men on the road. For practical jokers, they seemed to be making a tremendous fuss over their friend's escape. They were still waving their arms, evidently trying to signal the boat to turn back. "There's something fishy about this," muttered Frank. "I don't know of any train leaving Bayport at this hour of the day." "Neither do I," his brother replied in a low voice. "Those men on the shore seem mighty agitated over something or other. If it was a practical joke, they'd just give up and go back to the village. It's a pretty weird story." He seemed in an awful hurry to get away from Beaumont. "I have a good mind to turn back. We may be getting ourselves into trouble." "He'll be as mad as hops if you do. Tell him we don't want his money, and take him back to Beaumont." The more Frank considered the situation, the more he felt that the wisest course would be to turn back to Beaumont and wash his hands of the whole affair. The stranger's story about an approaching wedding might be true, and it might not, but there was a fact of which he was certain, that there was no train leaving Barrymont in an hour at that time of day. He turned to the passenger. "What time is your train leaving?" "About 10:30. "There's no train leaving Bayport at that time," said Frank flatly. "That's the time my train leaves," insisted the stranger, beginning to look somewhat flustered. "The earliest train is at noon," put in Joe. "I tell you this train leaves at 10:30. I just have time to catch it." "I'm afraid you're going to miss it," said Frank. "I'm going to turn back to Barmont." "Turn back?" shouted the man in consternation. "What are you going to do that for?" "I don't like the looks of this whole thing," said Frank, "considering that this is supposed to be nothing more than a practical joke. Those two men on shore seem to be making quite a big fuss over your escape. They're hoping they can persuade you to turn back. Then they'll have the joke on me after all." "They're going to have it anyway," said Frank with determination. "I've changed my mind about taking you to Bayport. We don't want your $10. "But you've got to take me to Bayport," exclaimed the stranger in high excitement. "I must catch my train." His bullying manner nettled Frank. "This is our boat, and we want to turn back. We can turn back if we want," he told the passenger. "We didn't ask you to come with us." "But you promised to take me to Bayport," stormed the stranger. "I've got to be there in time to catch that train." "There isn't any train at 10:30, and we know it. We're going to turn back to Bayport, and you'll have ample time to catch the noon train after that." The stranger gritted his teeth and half rose from his seat, and then he sank back as though realizing he was going beyond his rights by objecting. "A nice trick to play on me," he snapped, "bringing me this far and turning back. Your friends on the shore seem anxious to have you back, for some reason or other." Frank bore down on the wheel, and the sleuth slowly began to circle about. Suddenly the voice of the stranger rasped right at their ears. "Don't turn back this boat. Keep heading for Bayport." Startled, they turned. The stranger was standing right behind them, and in his hand he clutched a revolver that was aimed directly at them.